It was a cold morning in New York when Richard Collins, one of America's most respected businessmen, made a decision that would change his life forever. The man who had it all, fortune, prestige, and power, now found himself surrounded by a void no dollar could fill. The millionaire disguised himself as a pauper to test his son, and wept when he saw the result. It was a quote no one would have imagined to be true, but for Richard, it was the beginning of a test no father should ever face. What if your own child only loved you as long as the money was on the table? What if people's true worth only appeared when the lights went out? Richard didn't want answers, but fate would make sure to deliver them one by one in a cruel and revealing way. Before continuing, like, subscribe, and comment. Would you have the courage to do what Richard did? Richard Collins always believed that work was the true measure of a man's character. He inherited a small auto repair shop from his father, and it was from there, with greasy hands and dreamy eyes, that he built an empire. Decades later, as the owner of a chain of hotels spread across several American states, he could have had anything except what he wanted most: closeness to his son. Ethan Collins had grown up surrounded by comfort, expensive schools, luxury cars, constant travel. Everything Richard never had, he made a point of offering. But little by little that love faded amidst fancy dinners and business meetings. The boy who once called him a hero now treated him like a distant investor. Richard tried to convince himself that this was just a rebellious phase of youth, until the day he saw him mistreat a chambermaid at the family hotel, humiliating her for a simple mistake in her attire. That scene was etched in his mind like a mirror image. What did I do wrong? He thought. At what point did my son's heart become colder than the marble of our penthouses? He tried to talk. He tried to teach. But Ethan always reacted with contempt, laughing at his father's humility. "Father, the world belongs to the strong, not to the kind," he would say. Sharp words that cut deeper than any blade. Richard began to feel fear, not of losing the empire, but of losing his son to pride. Family gatherings became silent. Conversations were short and tense. Richard watched his son and saw in him a shadowy version of himself, shaped by success and warped by a lack of compassion. He wondered if money, the very thing that opened all doors, hadn't locked the most important one, the door to the heart. That night, sitting in the study of his mansion, Richard looked out the window and saw the city lights shimmering like false promises. "Perhaps I failed by giving everything and teaching nothing," he muttered. It was then that an idea began to take shape. A risky, unthinkable idea, and perhaps the only one capable of revealing the truth, because sometimes it's only when you lose everything that you discover who really stays by your side. And you, do you think money changes people or just reveals who they've always been? Like, comment and subscribe. What Richard does next will surprise you. For entire nights, Richard Collins paced his office as if searching the walls for the answer his heart had already given. The silence of the mansion weighed more heavily than any business meeting. Outside, the rain beat against the glass, reminding him that even the sky weeps when human pride becomes too high. It was in that solitude that he decided, if his son no longer knew how to see the value of others, he would make him see it, even if it meant losing everything to do so. The plan seemed like something out of a movie. Richard enlisted the help of his old friend Henry, a loyal former employee who knew every corner of the company. Together they created a disguise, worn clothes, torn shoes, and a fake beard that made him unrecognizable. Henry tried to talk him out of it. "You don't need this, Richard. It's dangerous." But the millionaire simply replied, "It's more dangerous to live without knowing who your son really is." In the following days, Richard quietly stepped away from business. He told his team he was going on a long trip, something about spiritual rest. But while everyone thought he was in the Caribbean, he walked the streets of New York like any other man, or rather like an invisible man. The cold bit into his skin, the smell of the street enveloped him, and for the first time in years, he got a real taste of the life he lived outside his hotel windows. On the fourth day, Richard went to the Collins Group headquarters, where Ethan now led meetings with the confidence of someone who felt untouchable. His father watched him from afar, hidden behind a group of pedestrians. It was strange, seeing his own son and at the same time not being seen. It hurt, but it was also revealing. Would he recognize me if I had nothing? He wondered. That night, Henry brought him simple food and a blanket. Richard, this could end badly. The millionaire smiled, tired but firm. If I have to suffer to know the truth, so be it. Lies have hurt me for too long. The plan was set. The next morning, he would go to the company's gate, not as the owner, but as a beggar, an old man asking for help. A test that wasn't just for his son. It was also for himself, to see if the love he believed in still existed. He stared at the dirty reflection in a shop window and barely recognized himself. "I'm just Richard now," he whispered. "And maybe finally, this is how I'll discover who I really am. Would you dare put yourself in his shoes? If you believe love is worth more than money, like, comment, and subscribe, because what happens in the next chapter will break your heart." The next dawn brought a biting wind. The New York streets felt colder than ever, and Richard, his face obscured by a fake beard and a torn old coat, walked toward the Collins Group building. Each step was heavy, not from physical exhaustion, but from the uncertainty of what was about to happen. In that moment, he was no longer the man from the business magazines, but someone invisible, a forgotten piece of the city, across the street. Employees hurried in, coffees in hand, indifferent looks on their faces. No one noticed the man hunched over on the sidewalk. Richard approached the main entrance and waited. Soon, a luxurious black car pulled up in front of the building. Ethan Collins stepped out, impeccable suit, superior expression, the look of someone who believes the world belongs to him. Richard felt his heart race. He approached slowly, his voice trembling. "Young man, could you help me with some food?" Ethan turned away, irritated. He didn't even look at him properly. "Stay away, old man," he said dryly, as if he were pushing away a nuisance, not a person. The company's security guard pushed him, and Richard fell to the sidewalk. The sound of Ethan's laughter echoed for seconds that seemed eternal. That moment froze in time. He, the father, kneeling before his son, and the son mocking, unaware of who the man before him was. Richard felt the ground spin. It wasn't just physical pain. It was something deeper. It was the collapse of a lifetime of love, work, and sacrifice. He slowly stood up, his eyes welling with tears, and murmured, "May God have mercy on you, my son, because I no longer have any strength." Security guarded him away from the entrance. The people around him pretended not to see, as if the suffering of others were just part of the urban landscape. The disguised millionaire walked aimlessly through the streets, stifling the tears that insisted on escaping. Maybe he's not cruel. Maybe he's just blind, he thought, trying to convince himself. But fate hadn't finished what it had started. The next day Richard returned, and again he was ignored. On the third day, he heard his own son order the security guard to get that dirty old man out of there. The humiliation no longer hurt. Now it burned. And each word was a wound that pride couldn't hide. That night, sitting in a damp alley, Richard cried as he hadn't cried since his wife's death. "I lost my son long before I put on this disguise," he thought. And there, amid the cold and silence, something inside him began to shift. He realized this test wasn't just about his son. It was about humanity itself, his own and the world around him. If this scene touched you, leave a like and comment. Would you recognize your father if he appeared before you with nothing on? And don't forget to subscribe. What Richard discovers next will change everything. The next few hours seemed endless. Richard wandered aimlessly through the streets, trying to understand what fate was trying to show him. The cold no longer bothered him as much. Perhaps because inside he was colder than the wind that had swept through New York that week. The man who had once dined at crystal tables now shared a piece of bread with a stranger sitting on the sidewalk. And ironically, it was there, among society's forgotten, that he began to see what truly mattered. A man named George, a former mechanic, invited him to take shelter under a canopy. "Here we share what little we have," he said, smiling, missing one tooth but still with a whole soul. Richard remained silent, watching this simple man share the last piece of food with a pregnant woman. It was a gesture he rarely saw in the luxurious salons where he lived. In the days that followed, Richard heard stories that disarmed him. People who had lost everything but still held on to faith. Men who slept on the floor but still prayed before every meal. Women who, even homeless, laughed as if life was still good. He realized he had spent years amassing wealth, but no amount of wealth had truly made him human. Every face he saw seemed to teach him a lesson. The beggar who helped another up. The girl who collected cans but set aside a coin to buy flowers. Small things but full of grandeur. These people have nothing, and yet they have more than my son and I combined, he thought. One afternoon, while walking near a square, Richard heard someone playing the guitar. It was a soft, simple song, but with a power that made time stand still. He sat on a bench and looked up at the sky. For the first time, he felt neither rich nor poor, just human. That night, he decided he would no longer run from pain. He would face his son, not with anger, but with truth. Because what he learned on the streets was clear. The world teaches too late what pride prevents from learning early. If this part of the story has already made you reflect, leave a like and subscribe. The next scenes will move you even more. The reunion between father and son is coming, and what happens next will surprise you. The day Richard had both feared and hoped for arrived. He had decided the truth needed to be revealed, not as a punishment, but as a mirror. He arranged a discreet dinner at his son's apartment, under the pretense of discussing business and acknowledging some recent investments. But this time, Richard was no longer the millionaire in the impeccable suit. He still maintained part of his disguise: simple clothes, a lightly trimmed beard, and eyes reflecting weariness and anticipation. Ethan, confident, received his father with an air of indifference. He thought Richard was there simply to monitor the company's progress, as he always had. But something in the man's gaze disconcerted him. He was different, more human, more vulnerable. He seems alone, thought his son, unaware that Richard's solitude was both a choice and a test. When everyone sat at the table, Richard began to talk, but not about numbers or profits. He spoke about the streets, about people sharing what little they have, about the value of honest work and empathy. Ethan raised his eyebrows, surprised by this version of his father he'd never imagined existed. Then, with a deep breath, Richard carefully removed the beard and coat that disfigured him. Silence fell over the room, like a heavy curtain. Ethan froze. His eyes filled with disbelief, not because he was standing before his father, but because he realized that the man who had mocked the old beggar was actually the one who had loved him unconditionally from day one. Richard spoke in a firm but choked voice. "You cast me out as a stranger. I just wanted to see if the man I created still existed within you." The son tried to justify every gesture, every cruel laugh, every indifferent look. But no words seemed enough to erase weeks of silent observation by his father. The revelation brought no relief. It brought shock, shame, and above all, a bitter lesson. Character cannot be bought, nor inherited. And there, in that moment, Richard realized his plan had achieved its most painful objective: to expose the naked truth. He didn't know if Ethan would change immediately, but the impact was already irreversible. His son's conscience had awakened, and now the only choice remained: accept the lesson or continue blinded by pride and vanity. If you feel the power of this revelation, like, subscribe, and comment. What would you do if you discovered your son didn't recognize you without your money? The next chapter will show the outcome no one expected. Days passed since the revelation. Richard returned to his routine, but something had changed. Not in him, but in Ethan. The son spent the first few hours in silence, reflecting on every gesture, every word, every look he had previously disregarded. The arrogance had faded, replaced by a profound discomfort he had never felt before, the awareness of his own failure. Finally, Ethan decided to seek out his father. But instead of a plush office or a formal dinner, He found him at the shelter Richard had visited in disguise. Surprisingly, the visit wasn't just about reunion. Ethan wanted to understand the world his father had seen, the world of ordinary people, of those who have nothing yet share everything. George, the man who had offered Richard shelter, and other residents watched intently as Ethan entered, nervous and remorseful. He knelt before his father and said, tears in his eyes, "Dad, I made a mistake. I didn't know what really mattered, but I want to learn. I want to change." Richard, his heart heavy, looked at his son, and for a moment everything seemed suspended. He could feel the weight of weeks of pain and pride, but also the hope of a new beginning. Ethan, love isn't proven with money nor measured with luxury. It's found in the way you treat others, in the choices you make when no one's looking. The son then spent weeks with his father and the humble people he had met. He learned about empathy, generosity, and the invisible value that money can't buy. The transformation was silent but profound. He began volunteering, helping those in need, and finally understood that the greatest legacy a father can leave isn't a fortune, but character and compassion. Richard, watching everything, felt a mixture of relief and emotion. The tears came not from pain, but from the realization that true love, when cultivated, always finds a way back. The lesson learned: wealth can buy comfort, but it never replaces humanity. If you were moved by this story, please like, subscribe, and comment. Do you believe a child's love can be rebuilt even after indifference? In the final chapter, you'll discover the definitive impact of this experience. A few weeks later, Richard Collins made a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of many others. Inspired by the lessons he had learned during his time undercover, he founded an organization dedicated to supporting homeless and vulnerable people. Ethan, now transformed, became an active volunteer, helping those who had previously gone unnoticed in his world of luxury. The hotel empire remained under his management, but the Collins family's true wealth no longer lay in its coffers or properties. It lay in its attentiveness to others, its ability to care without expecting anything in return, and the genuine love between father and son. Richard learned that even with all the money in the world, you can't buy character, empathy, or compassion. These qualities can only be cultivated and recognized in actions. His son, Ethan, now understood that life isn't measured by what one has, but by what one gives and how much one respects others. He became an example to everyone around him, showing that true change is possible when one faces one's own flaws and chooses humility. And so, what began as a painful test became a lasting lesson in the value of people. Love and humanity, Richard discovered, are greater than any fortune, greater than any pride, greater than any test. In the end, the true legacy a father can leave lies not in material possessions, but in the knowledge that kindness always returns, often in the most unexpected ways. If this story touched you, share, like, subscribe to the channel, and comment, what lesson would you take into your life? Stories like this remind us of